From a very young age, I always had an appetite for being useful, for doing something that has a purpose or that has an impact.
Hi there, thanks for being here. I'm Greg, a leadership and career coach. In this podcast, I interview people who follow their passion and purpose. I go deep into understanding their motivations, their constraints, and what was going on intellectually and emotionally in the key parts of their journey. With this podcast, I want to inspire others to follow their passion and purpose. If this is you, you may also be interested in my 6-week Find Direction course. You can find more information at www.derby.me. Be yourself, my friends. My guest today is Caroline Dewast. She is specialized in the humanitarian sector, working in crisis situations, conflict zones, and natural disasters. Caroline is currently working from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo for the UN Refugee Agency. Before this, she worked for the Norwegian Refugee Council and for the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. For her humanitarian work, she's also lived in the Philippines, Gaza, Peru, and even Fiji. I'm sure I'm missing some places in the list. And she's worked in Greece, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iran, Nigeria, Cameroon, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. And again, I'm probably missing some places. I invited Caroline not only because she has followed her purpose with great courage and passion, but also because before doing this, she had started her career in London as an architect. So she's got a lot to tell about what it takes to follow your purpose and also about making a career change. Caroline is also my sister-in-law. It's my great pleasure to have her as my sister-in-law. And she's the sister of Louise Dewast, who I interviewed earlier in the podcast. Caroline, I'm super excited to have you on the Derby podcast. A warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Just a little note of logistics. So Caroline is actually taking the call from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the line may be scratchy at times, but I guess it's part of the episode here. So Caroline, I thought we could start where you could describe what you're actually doing in Kinshasa.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some of my experience and decisions throughout the years. So today I worked, as you mentioned, for the United Nations High Commission for Refugee, and I am a shelter specialist. To explain that term, basically I specialize in providing emergency shelter for people that are affected by displacement. So that can be conflict related, or it can be related to some natural events, natural disasters, volcano eruptions. You might have heard earlier this year the situation in the eastern part of Congo with the volcano eruption. My specific role within the humanitarian response here is to coordinate all the different actors who are responding to people displaced. So I bring together all the different NGOs, whether they're national NGOs or international NGOs, including the Red Cross movement and the UN agencies who are involved in providing housing assistance to people affected by the crises. My role involves understanding the context and where the needs are. Where are people in need of assistance? Trying to find out who's working where and making sure that the different organizations speak to each other so that not everyone finds themselves in the same area, in the same town, and no one is somewhere else. So the idea is to try and make sure that people coordinate their work. And it is also trying to also provide this information to the partners themselves, to the actors that are responding, but also to inform upwards, to inform the donor community, to inform governments, so the information is really flowing both ways, not only to help the operational side, but also to fundraise, because then I have the big picture figures on how many people are in need, how many people have been assisted, and how many people haven't been assisted yet, and how much money is required to do so. Another part of the role is also agreeing on standards. So to avoid one NGO building a very nice and luxurious home and another one providing a tent. So we agree on a common strategy the first couple of months of a displacement, this is what we're going to do. After that, this is what we're going to do. So it's trying to establish the kind of rule of engagement somehow of the different actors who are responding to the crisis here. So there's a bit of strategic part, there's a bit of a strategic level to it of understanding the big picture, the big figures, communicating that, but also assisting the more operational level. We also do training. So we also train actors so that they can understand how to improve their operation, how to make sure they're selecting the right people who really are most in need of assistance. How do we consider all the different parts of building a house is not just building the house, it's also understanding why people are there, how long they're going to stay, can we actually build on that land, who will give us the authorization, so coordinating also with the local authorities so that they give us the authorization to build, negotiate for how long we're going to build. So yeah, it covers a wide range of areas. And it's very interesting, very challenging, but also very interesting.
It sounds incredibly challenging and complex as you describe it. It sounds like there are a ton of moving pieces, very high stakes in environments that are by definition in crisis. Wow. Actually, you can't imagine a much more complex environment and much more complex task that you described, actually. Thanks for describing it so well. And I think that gave a lot of details and context to where you are now for us to go back in time. And I'd be interested to hear from you where those seeds of the work that you do now got planted and when.
Yeah, a long time ago, actually, now that I think about it. So as you explained earlier, I started my career as an architect, and I when I left high school, I was very passionate about building better places for people. And I think that's what brought me to studying architecture. And I guess I was lucky enough to study architecture in a school of architecture, which had a very social-minded approach and also had a department within the School of Architecture on dealing with humanitarian response. And this was really by coincidence that in my second year of architecture, one of the teachers decided to do a course on reconstruction after the tsunami, the big tsunami emergency in 2004 in Southeast Asia. So that was the year. So it was actually the year after. I was in second year. It was in 2005. It just brought a whole new perspective on what it meant to provide housing for people. And it wasn't at all about design and construction. And when you study architecture, you solve problems through design and space and understanding space, understanding the user needs. It's not about the architecture. It's about the politics. It's about the environment. It's about natural events like a volcano eruption or a tsunami that you have no control of. And even if you build the strongest building in the world, won't withstand lava or a tsunami. So it was also quite fascinating to discover that everything I was learning in architecture, that you could solve society problems around space and living and quality of housing, there were certain things that you couldn't. But you had to do a much deeper analysis of the political context in which you were working and the geographical context. And I think this is something that really triggered me. I traveled a lot growing up, and I was lucky enough to visit a lot of countries whilst I was growing up on holidays with my family. And I got exposed to lots of different cultures and ways of living, and trying to understand these environments combined with architecture felt like something, this is very interesting. This is very intriguing. I want to dig a bit deeper, understand a bit more where can I go with that. I had never heard of humanitarian response and architecture being combined. This wasn't something I knew about. Mm. And so when you study architect, I studied architecture in the UK, and in the UK you have to take a year out to do a work experience, to do an internship between your undergraduate and your master's. And I decided instead of doing it like all my peers in London, I was I spoke a bit of Spanish and I had this appetite of traveling, and I thought, why not go to Latin America? And I started doing research, and I found this architecture practice that had started for a number of years in Europe. It was a French Peruvian architecture practice, and they were doing very traditional architecture in Lima, but they had won a number of awards. And I was like, this is interesting. It will bring me to my kind of travel aspiration, but also discover a new country. And whilst I was there, a big earthquake happened in a city a couple of hours south of Lima. And I got involved with a local NGO and who were specialized in building emergency shelter after natural disasters. And 3 days after the earthquake, with 250 volunteers that this NGO had mobilized, and they had a whole system in place with prefabricated units that they had in stock, and they had identified a couple of families in need. And over a weekend, I think we built 50 or 100 homes 3 days after the earthquake. And I was very intrigued. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. But okay, how can I really professionally combine this? I went as a volunteer.
Can I
Science.
pause you,
Yes.
Caroline? Two questions I'd love to go deeper on. But you said from early on you were interested in the humanitarian aspect. What do you
Mm,
think drove you to this interest?
mm. Actually, interesting you say that. I wasn't interested in the humanitarian aspect. I was interested in more the social aspect.
So what made you interested in the social aspect?
I don't know. I think from a very young age, I was also always had an appetite for being useful, for doing something that has a purpose or that has an impact. I think, uh, and maybe we'll get into this later because I went back and forth between my humanitarian aspiration and architecture and more traditional architecture, working in a more commercial area, which isn't to say that doesn't have an impact, but I was interested in maybe impacting more people and more people in need of support, of assistance. I had I don't know, a sensitivity to having traveled a lot, people living in conditions that I wasn't living in, people who were living in poor neighborhoods, who didn't have access to water, who I could see didn't have proper sanitation, proper access to services that I took for granted. And I think a lot of the travels I did growing up exposed me to these social differences and economic social differences, which I thought, wow, if I really want to have an impact, I want to be able to help those who need it the most. And I think that was an interest. And when I was studying and I did this course on humanitarian, when we were talking about this post-tsunami response, for me it was unbelievable that we see these in movies, people who lose everything overnight because of a situation like that. I couldn't even imagine how it would be to have to rebuild your life after that, after an event like that. And actually trying to dig deep into trying to make sense of, okay, how can we bit by bit support these people with the support of the government and with there's always many stakeholders involved to try and get out of this really difficult situation is something that I always found quite that touched me, I think, personally as an individual. And I felt I wanted to do something about it, or try at least.
You answered my second question through your answer right now. If we go back to where you were, so you helped in the city south of Lima, and you saw in 3 days how you could build 50 houses, and you were really intrigued.
Yeah, so I think I was intrigued, but I also saw a lot of flaws. I also saw that there are this very classical expression, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. I think it was always very important, and throughout my studies, to be very critical as well of people who try to do good. You see someone who's hungry on the street, you can give them food, or you can teach them a job so that they can feed themselves later on. And so I went there, I participated to this reconstruction effort, but I was also like, if I did this again, would I want to go back with this NGO and do this again? I was like, not sure. After the situation, I was supposed to go back to London and work in a more traditional architecture practice in the UK. And I decided to stay longer, and I worked for a local NGO who was working on slum upgrading. And I think this was another pivotal point in my career in that sense, where I was lucky enough to already be there, to have a network in the country, and people who work in architecture and in the social space is quite small. So after having done this 6 months internship in an architecture practice, I had already met a couple of people teaching at the university, also involved in different initiatives. And with this earthquake, had also brought a lot of interest from the architecture community in social issues, etc. So I found it's one of the largest national local NGOs in Peru that works on slum upgrading. I was fascinated because they had been working there for 40 years. They had a knowledge of the community that I could never hope to gain, but I gained a lot from seeing how they worked, how they engaged with the communities, with the authorities, with the municipality, and how bit by bit they were trying to improve neighborhoods through building community infrastructure, schools, how they were getting funding from philanthropists who wanted to give some of their money to improve some of the neighborhoods of their own cities. And that was a really fascinating experience in the process of when I look back at my career now, that that I've had the experience of working for a national NGO and understanding how they work. It was really valuable.
You said you were supposed to go back to London, to the UK, to work for an architecture studio, but you delayed, you postponed. How did you make that choice? Sounds like an important decision that you made.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, there was part of it that I was young. I felt young and free, and I was 21, and I felt there wasn't a lot of limits to what I could be doing. And I knew that a lot of people took 2 years out between the bachelor's and the master's. And so that kind of gave me confidence that I wouldn't be the only one extending and gathering more experience. So that definitely helped. I was already there, which also like going, I think leaving Europe to go and work for a national NGO might be a big step, but I was already living in Lima. I had worked for quite formal architecture practice, well renowned. It was going to be good for my CV, but working for this national NGO that no one has ever heard of would have been a more difficult decision, I think, from London. But I had the confidence as well whilst living in Lima that it was a recognized organization who had expertise that I could learn from. Yeah, and it took a bit of time of convincing my parents, because they were very generously also supporting me financially whilst I was living there. So that was also definitely a part of the decision making process, and I had to convince them that it was going to be an added value to my career.
Hmm. So it sounds like already there, you knew you wanted to add value to your career through the NGO path.
It was a hunch. I had done 6 months in this other architecture practice, which does really fantastic work, but I was bored. I found the work absolutely, utterly boring. And interestingly, I had a number of friends who had also come from France or other European countries to do an internship there, and they loved it. So it's very personal.
Mm.
That's when I realized like they had an amazing experience, and it wasn't for me. I knew it at that time that I had to search for an area within the construction sector because I still had an element that I really enjoyed about understanding construction processes and building. And I've always enjoyed building with my own hands and being on site. And there was a part of architecture that I wanted to keep. But the there was parts of it that I found that I didn't find interesting. I
Mm.
didn't I didn't get the how do you say the satisfaction of designing things in a certain way that look good. It wasn't enough for me. Well, and for some, and they do it much better than I do because they also spend more years doing it. They got a huge satisfaction in the details of a window and how a door and this is going to create specific light at this time of the day. And some people really find it absolutely fascinating. I didn't. This is also where I was like, am I going to continue with this architecture career? I have another 5 years to do if I want to qualify. So I had to constantly juggle back and forth between an area which I found really interesting, but so far financially was coming across as being maybe a bit difficult. Was
Mm.
I ever going to be able to work in the sector and pay my rent? At that time, it was still a big question mark.
You already had a hunch that you were interested in that, but you had your doubts that you may not actually be able to make a career out of this that was at least viable. And thanks
Yeah.
for sharing what you said about your experience in the studio in Lima, because that again and again, that's the type of information that comes to in the podcast here. People who start something in a career and then realize some people around them really appreciate, as you said, get satisfaction, get into the weeds, or appreciate getting into the
Mhm.
weeds of a certain profession or certain tasks or set of tasks. And for them, they're looking at those people and they're like, actually, that's the last thing I want to do this weekend is read a book about this. I want to do something else.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
obviously you can't build a career on what you don't want to do, but it's helpful
Mhm.
to know and be brave enough to acknowledge those signs, because in many cases, it's also the courage that you need to accept that actually what you've invested some time into, that it's not for you. And
Mhm.
that takes,
Mhm.
a lot of courage. Okay, you were young, you felt free, but it's not that simple. It sounds like you were hedging your bets.
I was also a bit concerned of my experience versus my peers. So the reason then I decided to take a second year work experience and I went back to London and I was like, I can't go back to do my master's with having worked in slums in Lima. Like I will know nothing about building construction law in the UK, which I was training to be a British architect. There were certain things that I felt I'm going to be lost if I don't also have this experience in the UK. Part of the decision was also I'm going to stay 6 months more, but I'm going to take another year to work in London.
Got it.
But when I went back to London in August 2008, if you remember, there was a big financial crisis. And I arrived in London, and a lot of my peers either went back to university or were still employed. And some, unfortunately, got laid off. And I was trying to find a job in that environment. And so there was a lot of questioning at that time. Did I make the right decision? What did I do? I'm wasting my time. I should have gone back to university. Or why did I do this fun experience in Lima whilst everyone was actually working hard? Not that I wasn't working hard, but it felt like I had done something I was really interested in, but it wasn't serious because was I ever going to be able to make a living out of it? Was it actually contributing to the more traditional architecture path? And so there was a lot of questioning when I came back. Eventually, I found a job doing administration in an architecture practice. I ended up by scanning 20 years archive of an architecture practice. But I felt at least I could have worked in a pub and earned the same money that I was earning in this practice, but at least I felt surrounded by people from the industry that are learning what I can in a really difficult environment where there wasn't a lot of jobs out there. But that also gave me the flexibility to pursue my career in the social areas I was interested in. That's when I started to get in touch with Architecture Sans Frontières, and I volunteered for them for 5 years on the side of my university degree and my multiple jobs between that time and yeah, 5 years later when I was working as an architect in London. And I learned a lot also from juggling different things at that time and accepting that maybe I hadn't made, or that there are certain things in life that you can't control, but you need to keep going and you need to find a way to make it worth it. And there's not much you can do in the face of a financial crisis. In the grand scheme of things, it was a year of my life. It wasn't that bad. And
Sure.
I was, lucky enough that I did actually eventually find work that helped me pay the rent.
Exactly. And so after that year, then you got back to university and finished your degree.
Exactly. And I went back to Oxford Brookes University after exploring different options. And one of the reasons I went back to Oxford Brookes is I could combine my diploma in architecture with a master's in development and humanitarian practice. So that was another strategic choice. I was accepted in other really good universities in London, which I was also interested in, and I wanted to change and study somewhere else. But then that's a moment in my life where I think I decided if I want to have this career in the development sector, studying it might also help me to understand whether there's a viable career that I can combine with architecture. I then qualified. I had a diploma in architecture. I had my master's in development and emergency practice, but I wasn't a qualified architect. And I had studied architecture for 5 years with breaks and internships. And at that time, I really wanted to just leave architecture and go and work for an NGO. And I had a lot of peer pressure and also personal pressure, I think, on going through the last phase, which is working 2 years in an architecture practice to get and you have to pass a test, and there's a number of exams, etc., on law, construction, and law, and business management, etc. And that, yes, it was another painful process to go through, but I'm very happy I did. Looking back at it, I was like, oh, but I know all these people who haven't, and I think it gives me a lot more confidence in my work today, even if I don't work as an architect. But I often meet people from government, and in countries where I work, a title is very somehow is gives me credibility. It gives me credibility to lead on a sector on housing, and beyond that, I also gained a lot of experience during those 2 years working in an architecture practice and following through projects from start to finish, which I hadn't done in my previous internship because of I was young and less experienced, and then this financial crisis. So I learned a lot, and it gave me a lot of rigor, I think, to my work today. Even if once again I felt similar things in my first internship, I found the work very boring, and I was
And
like, this is not for me.
when
Mm.
you took the decision, did you know at the end of those 2 years that you would jump onto the NGO side?
Yes, I quit my job the day I passed my last exam before I got the results. I knew that I had passed. I was 90% sure that I would have passed, but I was so eager to leave that actually at that same time I had been applying for jobs in NGOs. And I guess that was another big challenge actually, was getting a job because
In
I
an
think I
NGO.
applied to over yeah, because it's a closed loop. It's a difficult sector to get in. It's a very difficult sector to get a paid job. There's a lot of unpaid work. There's a lot of volunteering experience, and I would absolutely recommend it to anyone who wants to go into that sector. Get a feel, volunteer after work when you have time to understand how the sector works. But to get a paid job, this was the constant question. I'd been volunteering on the side of my architecture education, but also these 2 years working and doing these exams, I was running workshops in Cameroon, teaching people about architecture and participation and working with vulnerable communities at the same time, all of that at the same time.
Wow.
And it wasn't clear to me if I was going to be able to find a paid job in the sector. And I think I applied, and at that time, you probably remember it was just after the Haiti earthquake, 2010. And so they were looking for a lot of francophones. But I had missed the train. It was 2012, so it was 2 years after the earthquake. And most people who were there either had been there straight after. There was a bit of a closed loop of francophones turning in Haiti. And I think I sent over 30 or 40 different job applications. I got 2 interviews, one for a job that I didn't get, and one for an unpaid internship in Geneva. That's what I took. And I had set in my mind, I will not take an unpaid job. I now I've got a master's in humanitarian work. I speak 3 languages. I've got a diploma in architecture. I've got field experience with the work I'd been doing with Architecture Sans Frontières and my time in Peru. And I was just not getting anything.
I read somewhere that you had built a
Yeah.
network through your voluntary experience, but also through other routes. Wow. And how old were you when you took
Yeah.
that unpaid internship?
I was 28.
Yeah. Okay. You're 28 and you take an unpaid
Unpaid internship in Geneva, so it's
in
not a
Geneva,
cheap
which
city
is
to live in.
not the cheap place to live in. And so you took it.
I took it and I had lived on a really tight budget the last 2 years on my paid job, architecture paid job, because I don't know if I had a hunch. It was probably in the back of my mind, it was a possibility that I would need a bit of funding somehow, somewhere to be able to go to the next step. Some people had told me, if you don't get a job, just buy one-way tickets to the next disaster and just go and hang out with the aid workers there and you'll get a job eventually. That's another route that I know a lot of people have taken. It's pretty bold, but it gets you places apparently. No, and absolutely, I had built my network over the years. I had been to every single conferences, talks, presentation I found on architecture, development, social, humanitarian crisis response. Through my voluntary work at Architecture Sans Frontières, we had received a grant to develop some training for young architects and engineers who want to work with vulnerable communities. And this was a joint funding with Architecture Sans Frontières France, Italy, Sweden, Spain, and the UK. And so it also gave me a reach to what other Architecture Sans Frontières organizations were doing. And the UK branch was very focused on education and training and teaching and all of that. Whereas other Architecture Sans Frontières in Spain, they were building projects in other parts of the world. So that also gave me a lot of insight. And the masters I had also done, I also had a network through that of people who had and were working in the sector as well.
Sure. Sure. So despite all of this, the only thing you found was an unpaid internship
And
in
unpaid
Geneva for the Red for
through the United Nations High
the
Commission
UN.
for Refugees.
Okay. Which
Yeah.
sounds okay, still a very prestigious organization, obviously, in that field. And then what?
So I went there, I signed for 3 months, and I had an objective in my head, 3 months, pure networking. By the end of the 3 months, I need a job. That's what happened. I, I no, it was a challenging choice, actually. Everyone was like, "What? You just qualified as an architect and you're gonna take an unpaid internship? What are you thinking?" I even remember my boss looking at me being like, "What, you're gonna work for the UN? You're gonna take an internship for the UN?" But I was strategic. I didn't take any internship at the UN. I took an internship at the UN in the shelter sector. So as opposed to a lot of other interns I then met when I was there, I was the oldest as well. Like most people who do internship at the UN are straight out of undergraduate school, sometimes postgraduate school. I had another 2, 3 years professional experience on top of that. And they just wanted to work for the UN. I didn't want to work for the UN. I wanted to work in conflict crisis places. It was interesting to see how people were approaching it differently. And yeah, I kept a lot of good contact from that time. And I do believe that the job I have today with the same UN agency is also partly because 10 years ago I did an internship there, and then they saw my career evolve over the year, and that gave me some credibility of some insight within UNHCR.
How do you do networking? Sounds like you're pretty good at it. You said you attend every event that's relevant to your field, but then what do you do there? And what did you do when you
Yeah.
were doing this internship?
Yeah, very good question. I remember having a lot of discussions with people about how to network. Like, how do you meet people? How do you get noticed? Because that's networking is trying to get noticed by people who might be able to provide you advice or guide you or give you tips or ideas of where you can move next. So I remember going to talks and I would force myself to ask one question or at least try. So I would be super attentive during the presentation and I would think about and I would take notes and then think about something that I found interesting or I wanted more information about. And I would try and put myself out there and in front of a big audience, put my hand up and ask a question. And I felt very young in some of these places, surrounded by professionals and experts in the field. Sometimes it was a bit daunting, but I remember forcing myself to try and every time ask a question. Sometimes you put your hand up and people don't take your questions, doesn't matter. But at least I would leave this place being like, at least I tried. At least I
Mhm.
thought about something that I could have asked that was somehow not completely stupid. And then other people might come up to you, say, "Oh, I thought your point was very interesting. I've also come across a similar situation." So asking a question is not just for the panelists, it's also for the other people in the room who might be like, "Oh, this person asked the same question I thought about." And maybe they're going to come up to you and speak to you, and then you can exchange experiences. And so that's one thing I remember doing.
How did you do it when you were in Geneva?
I was very lucky. There was one of the former interns who first of all introduced me to all the different departments. When you arrive, they take you office by office and they introduce you. And then I would try and have lunch, day lunch with, first of all, my own colleagues, rather than going to spend my time with the other interns who were my age and were probably in a similar situation trying to get a job. I thought, no, I'm going to hang out with people in my team who have 10, 20 years experience more than I do, and ask them about their experience and where they've been and how they got there and some of the challenges. And yeah, being curious, asking questions to people who you might aspire to
Mm.
professionally, even if it can be sometimes a bit scary or a bit daunting.
Yeah.
There's another thing that I remember that I wanted to mention, tips that someone gave me when I was trying to figure out how to network. And they told me, never ask for something, ask for advice, because it's their choice to give you the advice they want to give you. If you ask them for a job, they feel cornered. If you ask them, oh, can you give me the contact of this person? They feel in a duty to give you something, but they don't know who you are. Whereas if you ask them for advice, if you ask them, so if you were in my position, if you were 20 years younger, how would you go about getting into the sector? It's a maybe less confrontational way of approaching people who probably have a lot to share but can't commit. So
Yeah.
it's yeah.
What I really like about what you said is once you clarified what you really wanted to do, you were just curious, like you said, curious about the what you could learn that could help you. And it was a great description of a growth mindset. For people who are not clear about what they want to do, sometimes networking sounds completely daunting. It's like, why would I network? But once you do know why you're networking, then confronting your fears and actually standing up and asking the questions, well, makes sense at least. This is
Mm,
why you're doing it. And that makes it easier. And then talking to people and being curious is much easier. Thanks for the great tips. And I love the tip on asking for advice instead of asking for something, because
mm,
I guess that's how you build trust with people and
mm,
relationships. So that also makes a lot of
mm.
sense. I'm looking at time and I'm a little concerned that we're just really at the beginning of your story. So to be very honest, I'm just hesitating. Do we break it up or do we try and pack a lot into a small amount?
Yeah, I mean, I think from then on, one thing led to the next. Everything we just spoke about, where the decision making moments, the back and forth architecture, development architecture, can I actually get a paid job in the sector? What does it mean? So when I made this decision to go at UNHCR, I still didn't know whether I was going to get a paid job, but I somehow felt closer to the network who could actually give me a paid job somehow. And after and during my time there, there was the big typhoon you might remember team. And UNHCR works very closely with the Federation of the Red Cross, and we were doing a lot of joint work together whilst I was there. So I got to meet a lot of people from the Red Cross. There were also some of my old university teammates who were working at the Red Cross in Geneva at the same time. So I was also reconnecting with the network of people I had studied with. And I think 3 days before the end of my internship, I got a call from the Red Cross saying, when can you leave? We need someone super urgently. We think we've got a job for you. Can you leave next week? And I packed my bags in a couple of days. Went to get my summer clothes from back home, and I left a few days later.
Into it.
Yeah, and then that it was super exciting. I'd been applying and waiting for it for weeks and weeks. I didn't know who I was going to work with. I didn't know where I was going to live. There was a lot of unknowns, and I hadn't worked for the Red Cross before, so I didn't know their internal systems and processes. And I also actually have to admit that I accepted a job that was within the shelter sector, but more on the data management side of things, which is not really my area of expertise either. But they were like, oh, but you'll do a bit of this. Don't you worry. We'll teach you, we'll help you out. But you can also do these other things that are more around construction, etc. So I also took something not, it wasn't the perfect job offered, but I'd been waiting for that moment to go to the field for so long that it wasn't a difficult decision at that time.
What made you want to go to the field instead of working in the headquarters of a big agency?
Going back to my initial interest of having an impact and working with people who are in need, it's not at headquarters that you work with people in need, it's in the field. So for me, it was very clear that headquarters was not for now, was maybe for later. And I've since gone back and forth between headquarters, regional office, back to the field, back to headquarters. And I think for me, it's a healthy balance to spend time in the field as well and understand the reality of a crisis response. And yeah, that's where it was definitely the United Nations is a complicated institution to work for, and I wouldn't have seen myself very happy just staying in Geneva and headquarters. I found I had never worked in a conflict setting before. I'd worked for a year in Peru, but it's not a conflict place. And I remember sitting in meetings and talking about the situation in Chad and in Afghanistan, and it sounded so abstract and so bizarre that it would have been very, very bizarre for me to stay in Geneva.
Mhm. Yep. But still, it has its, I mean, obviously, so you're on the field, you're directly helping people in need. And that is what your calling really was towards.
Mm.
But it's got a cost, right? You're away from home most of the time. You're living in difficult circumstances. How did you manage to balance that?
Mm. Yeah, I was just gonna mention that when you asked how was the decision of going to the field. So I was in a long-term relationship at the time, and it was very clear to my partner that I had this calling of working in the sector, and so he was kind enough and understanding enough to always encourage me in my professional aspirations, which I definitely thanked him for throughout my career. We're not together anymore. That's why I've been talking in the past. There was part of me that was also attracted by the adventure and the unknown. And I think that's also part of who I am. I've always had an attraction for that. I've been working in a number of contexts and I've been in numerous countries and I'm still living in Kinshasa today, but I have much less the desire to go to the field. I think I've been there. And maybe you're speaking to me from London, thinking, what is she talking about? She's in Kinshasa. Kinshasa is a bit removed from actually the crisis situation of the Congo, which is in the east, which is a 4-hour flight from Kinshasa. Kinshasa is a big city that is very hectic and challenging in many ways, but this is not where the core of the work is being done by partners, by organizations who are working to provide housing for displaced people.
Mm, yeah. People heard the list of countries where you lived in, where you worked for, and it's just incredible. The impact you've had in so many places is, at least to me, super inspiring. When you look back, and obviously it's only a beginning, you've done so much in a few years in this path, at least in working for NGOs. What would you say has been most rewarding to you?
Interesting and challenging question. You just summarized a little bit my last couple of years of working in many different contexts and places. some of these places I only visited for a couple of weeks for training. So I think I want to put things also a little bit into perspective, and the impact I've had is very removed from the impact of people who are in the field every single day building homes there. There's many different layers to the work in this sector. And I've questioned a lot the impact of the work that aid workers do, that development workers do. And it's part of studying it, but it's also part of global politics. You always question how much money is being poured into aid, and people are still starving, and there's still problems of malnutrition, and people are still badly housed, and there's still conflict. And where is all this money going to? So I've had my fair share of questioning the actual impact of my work, and going back to what I'm most proud of, where I've had the most impact, I think is directly on the colleagues and the people I've worked with directly. And I think that's enough for me. It's enough that I've touched and I've worked with people day in, day out who live in Gaza today. And I've just worked with the two engineers that who were my two colleagues who we were following up on projects. But I feel that I've given them some tools that maybe they didn't have the chance to learn because we've studied in different parts of the world. I've given them a confidence of what they're doing. I've given them other perspectives because I come from the outside and I see things slightly differently. And this is the same thing for me here in Congo. As I was saying, I'm in Kinshasa. I'm very far from actually the conflict. But here I'm working with Congolese who are trying to also understand how the sector works. And now I've got 10 years of experience in the sector. I know how the machine works. I know how to be efficient. I also know what people expect and how to do better data analysis. I know I know what to look out for. I don't know the context, and I will never claim to know all the context I've worked in. I'm an outsider giving people from the inside an outside perspective and giving them the opportunity to think outside the box and see how things can be done differently. I have friends who work in protecting civilians from conflict, and they tell me, I feel I've never saved a single life. And I'm like, maybe you haven't, but the work you've done through your team and the teams of your teams, etc., have. But it's in the reality, as an international aid worker, we're often removed from the reality of the nitty-gritty of the field for multiple reasons, of not being able to speak the language, not having access because we're target being from a certain culture or ethnic background. So for me, I gained satisfaction, and I think my biggest impact and what I'm most proud of is the work I've done for my direct teams I've worked with in all of these different contexts.
Now, the flip side of the question, what's been most challenging?
Yeah, I think what's most challenging is probably very obvious, is balancing a healthy life, family, friends, relationships whilst doing this job. And I think that's a constant also juggle back and forth. And this is also why I've been back and forth, and I've spent 5 years living in Europe for an organization at regional level, which allowed me to see many countries, but I was always going back home where I was living with my partner and having a bit of a more normal life in Europe, but then also missing the field and missing having a more building a team, building something in some of these contexts, which I'm doing right now in Congo. And I think, yeah, the constant challenge is that, and maybe I'm missing the also very obvious part, which is the context itself. I'm dealing every day with people who are the poorest of the poor and have, on top of that, lost everything or are constantly targeted by groups or and that's also a challenge which I think we build tough skin around. but we often forget as humanitarian workers how much it actually affects us. And yeah, I remember times coming back from some of my trips needing a couple of weeks, sometimes even a couple of months to digest some of the stories, some of the people I met, and still, yeah, still today, some, I'll remember forever different people I've met over the years in these different contexts.
Yeah, it's difficult if it's your job to supposedly fix the problems that are always there and you actually see the problems in the thick of it, the
Mm,
most seemingly insurmountable problems. And that's your job to actually try and fix this. That's first, it's high stakes, and second, it's difficult to be confronted with obviously the responsibility, but also just
mm,
the reality of it. It's actually, I don't know what it is like, but I can just try and
mm,
imagine. It reminds me a quote that it's not a quote, but something that Melinda Gates was saying about in her book that Barbara was listening to, which talks about at some point you're so overwhelmed by the weight of the responsibility of trying to fix all of those problems. And ultimately, I had to give up that weight of the responsibility and just do my best. I should stop here. But it doesn't mean that what doesn't hurt or
yeah.
impact you.
What we learn is that you can't fix anything. We can't. We're just trying to make it less worse. And we're a cog in the wheel. I focus on housing, someone else focuses on food, someone else focuses on health. I can't fix someone's situation. I can just come up with my small added knowledge and expertise in my sector. And I think remaining over the years, I've realized remaining really humble about what we can do and what is also possible. Because yeah, you learn this when you work in the sector, and I think also medical professional also learn that to not give hope in areas that you don't control. I remember doing a first aid training, and the person was telling us never to say it's going to be fine because you actually don't know if it's going to be fine.
Mm.
But you can say, I'm here for you, I'm listening. What can I do to help? Not creating hope in areas where you don't have control. Also, I think helps the person listening not to hope things from you that you can't give, but it also helps you as an individual not to give things that you can't actually.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you work in the social caring sector, it's important to also know how much and what can you give. And I see my job today as a job. It's my profession. I'm not just trying to save the world. I spend my days in front of Excel spreadsheets and writing strategies. It's a professional career that has its whole own industry.
So what's next for you?
I'm here. I'm in Kinshasa, and I'm probably be here for a while. There's a lot to be done here. It's a country that is the size of Western Europe. I feel like I'm covering 6 or 7 countries at the same time. But then we'll see. I don't know. I think I'll probably try and find a way again to come back to Europe and have a better balance with my personal life. I feel I've gone through my careers in steps. I feel it was architecture, humanitarian work, and now I'm doing a professional boost, and then I go and invest a bit more in my life, which eventually I have to, considering the work I do, I think a lot of the progression in my field is more when I'm out there in the field. So I'll have to pay the cost professionally. I can still work. I'll still be doing interesting things. But yeah, I think it's always you can never have it all. That's something I realize. You can't have the perfect dream job, living in the perfect city and with all your friends and your the best love life and family and all of that. So it's always a bit of a juggle between these different things. And so for now, I'm happy here, and I feel I'm learning a lot. I'm learning about a whole continent and a very big country and an organization I haven't worked with before as well. And I think when I feel I've stopped learning and or I've lost hope or I'm too tired, it will be time to change and do something else. But
Mhm.
I think I'll stay in the sector for a while longer. I'm still enjoying the thrill. Every time I pack my bags to go to the field, there's a bit of stress, but healthy adrenaline as well. Yeah, I think I'm quite lucky to have followed a career that gives me a lot of excitement, which I definitely need in my life.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And we didn't talk about this, and it's not the purpose of the podcast, but I'd be curious to hear your perspective. I was expecting to hear, in a way, to my question on what's been most challenging, to hear about being a woman in such a space where you travel to that, let's call them, in some cases, macho countries, dangerous environments. How has that affected you? Or what role has that played, being a woman following the career path that you followed?
I don't know if that has, or that's the only reason. I grew up in a family of four girls. I have a wonderful mother who's given us a great example of combining work and family. And I think a part of me was also always driven to work and succeed professionally as a woman. uh, Working in the sector is definitely challenging, but I think it's also challenging in other contexts as well. And maybe it's less visible, it's less in your face. But I think discrimination, women face discrimination also a lot in more Western cultures. And sometimes it's even harder to tackle it because it's less visible,
It's
because
more
it's less
insidious.
obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's not to say that it hasn't been a challenge for me. I think it's been really important to work with to see how other women older than me were maneuvering through different cultures and different societies, and asking a lot of questions. I remember my first trip to Afghanistan. I had a one-to-one with the country director, who was a Australian woman who'd been living there for 10 years. And she told me what clothes to buy, when to put it when I was in the plane. So I think there's also a lot of support within the women community working in the sector on how to deal with being a woman in the sector. I think I've become more and more of a feminist over the years. And has does that is that related to my work or being a woman in the sector? I don't know if it's I think it's probably a combination of things. But I've also seen fantastic projects led by women in places like Afghanistan, by women engineers who were leading construction projects, which today, very unfortunately, would be impossible. But it gives me a lot of strength, actually. It has also given me a lot of strength to see women in societies that very visibly are discriminated, but are breaking boundaries over and over again. And yeah, I find it so admirable to, yeah, observe their strength and dedication to break those cultural barriers.
As we're about to part, any comments, words that you would have liked to say, especially considering people who are either looking for direction or have direction, but are hesitating to follow it?
I work a lot with my gut feeling, and I had this hunch from very early on that there was this this sector that I was interested in, and I didn't know whether it was going to be possible or not. I think, yeah, remain curious, ask questions, try and meet as many people as possible who are in the sector or around or working in kind of similar areas, and that might give people insight on how to go about it. And I think hearing different stories, a bit like what you're doing with this podcast, giving a voice to different stories, and I think it's very powerful. And don't give up. It can take many years, and it took me years of going back and forth for various reasons. But I'm very happy I pursued it, because I think I would be really miserable if I was working in an architecture practice. I think I would not be a very happy person. And I think the world needs more happy people. So follow your dreams.
Well,
Maybe that's a bit cheesy.
okay, but I like it, and I guess that's also the purpose of the podcast is follow your dreams, because they're to some extent realistic, which obviously is a question that you've asked yourself many times, and that's why you were doing your back and forth. But you saw a path, and you saw the possibility of making your dream a reality and a career, and
Mm,
we've done. So not that
yeah.
necessarily every day it's the dream, but it's very meaningful and purposeful and feeling useful. And even though sometimes, like you said, it's more for the colleagues you worked with, it's a great story that you shared, and I'm very, very grateful that you've been with us today. So thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this time as well.
I hope this episode inspired you to follow your passion and purpose, because that's my mission with this podcast. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and family. Also, if you know someone who's looking for direction, I run a 6-week course which combines deep personal work, group coaching sessions, and a buddy system. Participants love the course. You can learn more at www.darebe.me. Darebe is spelled DAREBE.me. Darebe yourself.